Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you our next topic in our French Wars study, which is now a feature series on the Peninsular War. If you haven't already, do make sure you've gone back and checked out all my information videos regarding how land warfare is conducted in this era in the 1790s all the way up to the 1810s. It's very important we understand what infantry, cavalry, and artillery are, because those things are going to be really important for understanding the nature of combat during the Peninsular War. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we've covered quite a bit in our series so far. We've done quite a bit on the naval warfare, and it's brought us up to the mid-1800s. And so in this video, what we're going to look at now is our transition into the land war, that Nelson tragically died at the Battle of Trafalgar, but despite his death, the British were very successful and they overwhelmed the Spanish and French fleets. In doing so, Britain now has massive naval dominance, and because of that, they're therefore still in the war and therefore arguably the most successful nation fighting against France that is left. So in this series, we're going to now explore how Britain finally gets towards their land campaigns. They've done a little bit of engagements here and there. We had some in Egypt during the Battle of Aboukir Bay and Alexandria, and we've had some going on in Europe throughout the war, particularly earlier on at Toulon. But they've been quite quiet since. They haven't really done a whole lot. They're more focused on the East Indian campaigns and what's been going on there. So what we're going to see now is this transition that happens when the Peninsular War is underway. So we're going to explore this conflict and how in a lot of ways the British try and achieve victory against the French in a decisive manner. For all that said, let us get straight into it. So firstly, let's understand the situation by 1808. As we established, the British have now got naval dominance, but despite that, Napoleon and his Grande Armée have been working hard to be victorious on land in Europe itself. By 1808, Napoleon has had numerous successes. He's beaten back the Austrians, he's beaten back the Prussians, and the British still have not been able to stop his massive expansion that's happened. Many military historians would argue he peaked with his masterpiece at Austerlitz, where through his victory he eliminated the opposing forces and forced them into surrender. This has left him with two major enemies. He now has the Spanish, who he wishes to control, who he now sees as weakened after the defeat at Trafalgar, and he also has the Russians, who he wants to take down as well. His big dream is to expand throughout all of Europe and control it all. He now has quite a lot of it and wants to control the rest of it. Napoleon, of course, also has the big threat from Britain. However, he's able to overcome it is to enforce his continental system. However, as we established, this system has not been so successful because Britain still has its naval dominance. If anything, Britain actually is disrupting more trade for the French. Through its success at Trafalgar, it's cutting off many trade routes that are coming in from America, for example. So Napoleon decides to change tactics. He instead decides to focus on taking Spain instead. So in 1807, a French army marched through Spain and seized control of Portugal, which was still trading with Britain at this time. Napoleon was determined to bring Spain under his control. In 1808, he poured even more troops into it, taking over key cities on the context of supporting them. So much so by April 1808, he persuaded but basically forced King Charles to abdicate and his son Ferdinand as well. And then he put his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, his elder brother, as the new Spanish king. He believed that there would be very little opposition to this through all the power they demonstrated, his Grand Armée marching in and defeating the Spanish as they had done. There'd be very little resistance. By June that year, the whole of Spain took up into arms. They engaged in what's called guerrilla warfare, where despite their landing armies being defeated, they could conduct small skirmishes, they could conduct bombing raids, they could destroy supply routes. They couldn't outright defeat the French army in open pitched battle combat. But what they could do is disrupt, damage, and deter, and make the French rule of Spain very, very difficult to maintain, if not frustrating. In fact, as this guerrilla campaign was going on, Napoleon would eventually call Spain an ulcer on his resources and his focuses for his greater ambitions in Russia. The British government realised the situation and they decided to support Portugal, seeing it as a key chance to not only support a key ally, also to strike a severe blow against a distracted and arguably weakened French army. So using their superior navy, they secured a port at Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, and then used that to, of course, then progress inland and fight against the French. And so what I want to show us here now is this map campaign. You'll see from our map here that there's quite a few extensive battles that will happen in this Peninsular War. Again, this is just the first stage we're going to look at in today's video. This is quite a long war. It's going to span over about 6 years, and we're going to see it's going to take place all over Portugal, all over Spain, and even by its end, it's also going to breach into southern France as well. We'll get there, but I think it's very important to take a note of this map. Perhaps if you like, as you're making your notes, you can make a note of all these battle campaigns, and as I mention them and as I go through them, you can make a note of where they are in the timeline, and particularly as well for our studies, consider which ones are a British victory, and likewise which ones the French managed to secure a win over in the timeline. I won't mention every single battle. Again, it's quite an extensive war, and this is where my further reading I'll offer you will be very, very important. But we will look at some key campaigns as we go through. So let's consider the initial invasion from the French and how the British responded. As we said, the French had taken over most of Spain, and Napoleon had made sure his own brother Joseph was now the one who was monarch over them. In 1808, Arthur Wellesley, later to be called the Duke of Wellington, was given permission by the Secretary of State for War, Robert Stewart Castlereagh, to be deployed in 1808. He came with a force of 13,000 men and intent on fighting back against the French. He joined with about 5,000 Portuguese soldiers, and in August he had a significant victory where he defeated the French army at Rolica. And 4 days after this, he moved on to Vimeiro, and he had a successful campaign there as well. He was so successful, in fact, that he actually managed to force out the French from Portugal, made them evacuate, and suffer significant losses. After this, though, and against Wellesley's desires, the British government accepted an armistice and agreed that the 24,000 soldiers they captured in Portugal could be transported back to France on British ships. Wellesley was very much disdained by this. He believed victory had been assured. They could have really pushed on, robbed Napoleon a lot of his Grand Armée. Wellesley was still praised. He was given lots of honour for, of course, his victory in Portugal. But he was recalled all the same and had to return to Britain and leave command under Sir John Moore. Moore was a very experienced commander. He had fought in the American Revolutionary Wars. He'd also fought in Egypt and against the Netherlands. And in fact, many would argue at this time he was Britain's most respected commander. It wasn't Wellesley. Wellesley was good, but Moore had the greater credentials. He was also older. He was 47 at this time. And it was seen as he was the one who could control this 30,000 strong army they had deployed there, and therefore cooperate with the Spanish in pushing the French out of Spain. He marched into Spain in October 1808, and he was intent on pushing out the French. However, by the time he reached a place called Salamanca in late November, his men were massively tired. About 10,000 of them had fell sick since leaving Lisbon, and the campaign hadn't been going so well for them in the weather. Concurrently, Napoleon himself now left France, and he marched into Spain with 200,000 soldiers from his Grand Armée. By January 1809, confronted John Moore's men at a place called Corunna. Facing pressure, Moore decided to strike first, and he attacked northeast of Napoleon's position. He hoped that doing so would scare Napoleon off and force him to march back and retreat. However, during the engagement in January 1809, Moore suffered heavy casualties, and by January 16th, Moore himself was forced to fight against the French vanguard outside Corunna. 15,000 British troops held their position against the French force, and they lost about 1,000 men in the engagement. Moore himself was killed in the skirmish. The British army had no choice but to retreat, and they fled. 26,000 men managed to escape, but it's estimated about 7,000 have been lost in the scramble to escape the country. Despite all the praise Moore had been given, he was seen as quite indecisive in this battle. He wasn't seen as very, very capable, and many mistakes had been made. However, the British did not want to surrender. They knew this had been a massive setback, but they didn't want to give in. And so instead, the decision was made to reinstate Wellesley and have him go back to Portugal and try and launch a new offensive against the French and make up for the errors that had happened. And the thing is, at this point, it's very important for us to understand exactly who Wellesley actually is. So who exactly was Arthur Wellesley? Well, Arthur Wellesley was a man born into the minor aristocracy in Ireland. He was born in Dublin, and he was the fourth son of the Earl of Mornington. He was educated at Eton College, and to be honest, he wasn't the best academic. He didn't really do very well. It was only when he turned 18 in 1787 he decided he would make a go at joining the army. His family had sufficient influence, and they were to pay on commission and reach an officer rank. He had always had a fascination with war. He'd been studying battles, tactics, strategy immensely in his youth and now early adulthood. By age 25, he was now fully qualified, and he took his training seriously. He showed an eagerness for battle, a natural boldness and instinct for attack, and he was rather fearless. He had this unwavering spirit to never quit or consider defeat a possibility, which set him apart from the rest of his fellow officers. He didn't fear loss. He believed they could achieve great success. He achieved his military reputation fighting in the campaigns that had been going on in India. The French had supported uprisings there, and it was on Wellesley's troops in 1797 to go on campaign and fight against them. He did well against the Indian sepoys, so much so by 1803 the campaign had been won, and he was knighted for his exploits in 1804. He developed quite a lot in his time in India. He developed a true belief in something known as the tactical retreat. He had saw the likes of Napoleon have great successes by attacking a smaller force and overwhelming them, and baiting them into combat that they would surely lose. So he instead devised an idea of simply retreating. They would give up space willingly and then attack another day when it was a better chance to do so. He also became a master of terrain concealment. He developed this idea of a reverse slope defense, where understanding artillery could bombard a position, he instead would retreat his men behind the land, behind a massive hill, and take away the key clear line of sight that artillery relied upon. And also, it was a great way to deceive the enemy as well. And so, in this Peninsular War, when he's redeployed, he of course makes it very, very important to use the terrain of Spain and Portugal to his advantage. He also saw the great need of a coalition. Rather than fighting alone with just the British troops, he worked hard to secure a coalition with the Portuguese and Spanish. And we'll see later when we get over to Waterloo, towards the end of our series, also forms a great alliance with Marshal Blucher and the Prussians. Another key question to consider then throughout this series is trying to understand, do we really believe the reputation that Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, is indeed right to be remembered as one of history's most victorious generals? So let us carry on now and see what he did. Now he's been reinstated into the campaign in Spain against the French. So by April 1809, Wellesley has now returned to Portugal, and he's now the clear commander of the Anglo-Portuguese force they possess. Napoleon, meanwhile, has left, chosen to return to Paris, leaving his marshals, especially Marshal Massena, in charge to help his brother Joseph control Spain. Wellington immediately decided to reorganize the British forces. He divided the infantry into a self-directed autonomous divisions of approximately 10,000 men each. He ensured each brigade of 5,000 men was provided with a company of 100 skirmishers of the Rifle Brigade. These were men who were known as the Green Jackets because they wore green jackets to act as camouflage. And unlike the Brown Bess muskets, these men had the long-barreled Baker rifles, which could shoot more accurately across a longer range of distance. And also, the skirmishers, as we've established in our infantry video, were better trained and could load the muzzles much faster than the average soldier. The Portuguese units were integrated into the British brigades, with Wellesley training them up to improve their capabilities of command. He saw they used mostly mass formations, and he wanted to improve that to, of course, make a more flexible, powerful force, much like his British soldiers. However, the French were on their way. Massena decided to invade Portugal with 65,000 of his men and decisively attack key positions throughout Portugal. Wellesley quickly took to a more defensive approach, deciding to concede space and instead allow attacks to be hit into the position and defend. He truly followed a principle of war that it was always easier to defend a position than it was to attack into one. And a key part of this idea was the lines of Torres Vedras. These were a construction of formidable defences some 30 miles long, all the way from the north of Lisbon, quite literally up to a place called Torres Vedras, higher in the distance. He used Portuguese labour, or sappers, people who could make trench lines. He made sure his 150 soldiers and engineers were supervising the Portuguese labour. They formed three defensive rings. The first was a 26-mile line all the way up north, which ran from the Atlantic to the River Tagus, and had linked forts, earthworks, and covered passes all the way up to Lisbon. He also made use of the Royal Navy, ensuring they protected the Atlantic flank, using their gunboats to make it hard for the French to cross. He then made a more fortified line of defences behind the first one. The third and final line would protect the British army if somehow it was forced all the way back to Lisbon and had to flee by sea from Portugal. By the time of their completion in mid-1810, the lines were manned by 25,000 Portuguese militia, 8,000 Spanish troops, and 2,500 British artillerymen and marines. Wellington's own main army of nearly 60,000 strong was deployed behind the lines, ready to counter-attack into the French if ever an attack reached that far. Massena was truly overwhelmed by these defensive lines. He understood they were too strong to break through. However, he was too prideful. He didn't want to retreat. And so, despite his men running out of food, he kept pushing onwards. Wellington kept falling back. He also instituted the idea of scorched earth, where he was burning and destroying food stocks, so when the French took the land they conceded, they did not have the supply necessary to live within them. This kept the French army hungry and cold, and so by the time we get to winter setting in November, Massena knew the attack was not going to work. He had to swallow his pride and finally retreat himself. Wellington understood the retreat was going to be long, and then rather than counterattack, he allowed the French to leave. He believed that starvation of dysentery and disease would wipe out most of the French. He was right. Until February 1811, about 500 French soldiers were dying each week simply from lack of supplies and exhaustion. By March in 1811, Massena had made the full retreat back into Spain, and the French had evacuated Portugal once again. All in all, he lost somewhere around 30,000 men and lost many of his artillery cannons as well. Apart from a small piece of Portugal in Almeida, Portugal was now completely free from French control. And this set up the possibility of the British and Portuguese finally launching their own offensive, and maybe, through Wellington's desire to just retreat and allow the French to exhaust themselves, he can now counterattack in the spring and secure key successes for his forces. But that we'll find out in our following video on this series. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you found this quite insightful. Again, this is just the first stage, our background information, and of course building up to this initial offensive with Wellesley at the lines of Torres Vedras. A key victory perhaps for him to have achieved, and despite the setbacks that had happened with Muir's defeat in 1809, by Wellesley coming in and securing these successes on the defensive and exhausting Massena's troops, perhaps now the British can achieve an outright victory on the offensive the following year. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to this series to keep track. We are going to be adding more of these daily as we go through our series this term. And of course, if you want to learn more about campaigns, perhaps for Miro, Talavera, again, maybe even the lines of Torres Vedras, do check out my wider reading down below. It's always there for you to expand more and learn more history than what my introductory videos can offer. With all that said, thank you once again for watching. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.